Moving on to fats. So earlier I was sharing how I love talking about macros in the lens of a car, especially since I just recently started driving. And so when we talk about protein, I like to say it's the exterior, interior, physical components, the building block of the car. Now when we talk about fat, the fat is actually one of my most favorite components of the car. It's the AC, it's the check engine light, it's all of the internal components of the car that make a car so amazing to drive, especially when you're driving 3 hours to Connecticut. So it's all those internal components. And when we think of fat for our body, it's our hormones, it's our testosterone, it's our estrogen. It's all of these mental components, emotional components that our hormones are involved in. And the reason it's so dangerous to not have enough fat is because this can actually begin to negatively impact our mental well-being as well. So fat intake is critically important for all other nutrient absorption as well. In fact, I want to share a quick story with you here. And before I do that, just like proteins are made up of amino acids, fats are made up of fatty acids. And similarly, you have essential fatty acids, which you got to go out and get, like omega-3s from salmon as an example. And then you have non-essential fatty acids, which your body can produce by itself without any help. So I actually want to share a quick story with you about the rabbit starvation. So there were a group of soldiers that were stranded on an island after a big battle. Maybe their plane had crashed and they had no source of food, and they finally found rabbits. And rabbits, talk about quality of protein and on the hierarchy, are the leanest source of protein, virtually no fat. And these people were eating rabbit meat during a period of a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and they died of starvation. And here's why. Because without that fat intake there, the protein didn't absorb properly. And so what we take this to mean is that Mother Nature doesn't make mistakes. We make mistakes. So there's a reason why the egg yolk comes with the egg white. It's because you can't digest the egg white without an egg yolk. You can't digest protein without fat. So fats are critically important to make sure we are absorbing nutrients, right? This is why you have even vitamins. Some of them are fat soluble, some of them are non-fat soluble. What does that mean? That means you need to eat. Why do you need to eat with your medicine sometimes? Why does it help with the digestion of it? This is all part of this. Fats are critically important. It goes back to saying we can't restrict any single one of these components: protein, carbs, fats. They're all equally as important. So moving forward from there, where does the low-fat myth really come from? It's because it is a myth, right? Oftentimes you hear low fat, low carb, high protein, all these different things being thrown around. Where does this come from? Well, in the early 1920s, coronary heart disease was virtually unheard of. And during the same time, because of the world wars, World War I, World War II, a new way of processing food came about known as hydrogenation, right? And it was essentially a process to help feed our soldiers. And for its purpose, it did very well. It fed our soldiers in a very efficient way. And the food processing companies began to realize that this might be a good way to feed the general public. This is very efficient. Cost-wise and profit-wise, it's also a good look as well. So what happened during the same period of time from the 1920s over a period of 50, 60 years to the 1970s was that coronary heart disease cases grew. They grew so much so that it became the second leading cause of death among Americans during this time in the United States. Now, if we look at a chart next to that, intake of animal meat and animal fat during the same period decreased. Not by a whole lot, but it decreased. And oftentimes we hear, wait a minute, coronary heart disease, you shouldn't be eating butter. You shouldn't be eating steak. You shouldn't be eating egg yolks. You shouldn't be eating animal protein or animal fat. Yet when we look at the data, it's almost no correlation with, or even an opposite correlation with eating animals, animal fat, and the rise of the cases of coronary heart disease, cholesterol, and a lot of the other all-cause mortality that we see today, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases as well. So here's the reality of the situation. During this time, like I was mentioning, animal fat decreased from 83% down to 62%, and dietary cholesterol only increased by 1% in the American diet. So you often will hear, don't eat too many egg yolks, don't eat too much steak, it's bad for your cholesterol. You guys ever been to like one of those hot dog eating competitions? Yeah? So I like to say, you eat 12 hot dogs in a day and nobody bats an eye, but you eat 3 whole eggs a day and everybody loses their mind. So essentially, how did this happen? And here is the reality. During the same period, intake of trans fats, so hydrogenated fats, we're talking about things like ice cream, we're talking about donuts, chips, pretzels, just food that isn't really food if you think about it. It's not whole food, it's processed food. During this time, the intake of trans fats, increased by 400%. And the intake of processed food and processed sugars increased by 62% during the same period. And sugars are not bad. There's nothing wrong with sugar. Fructose, that's naturally occurring in fruit. There are sugars that are even naturally occurring in oatmeal and sweet potatoes and vegetables. These things are not bad. Processed sugars even, they have their place. You can have them in moderation, like we were talking about earlier. The challenge is when 80% of our diet is coming from processed food and from trans fats. This is where we begin to take a turn. And so, with that said, there are 3 types of fats: trans fats, saturated fats, and then unsaturated fats. So again, trans fats are everything you're seeing here. You have bagels, pizza, hot dogs, pie, cookies. Again, these things have their place. In moderation, not only are they okay, but they can even help with making sure that we're staying on track with our eating regimens and our fitness plan as well. Now, the challenge is trans fats structurally are closer to plastic than actual food. They more resemble plastic in their chemical breakdown than real food. Yes, they do not break down the same way food does, unfortunately. And so when we talk about cholesterol, and we talk about all-cause mortality, diabetes, glucose, insulin resistance, all of these different things, neurodegenerative disease, atherosclerosis, right? Your arteries being clogged up. These things don't happen because you had one too many steaks, or you had a little bit too much butter on your bread, whatever the case may be. These things happen because, one, of excess body fat and the ratio of too much body fat relative to muscle. But the more important reason behind why these things happen is because we're eating foods that are highly processed and that aren't really food. That's something that I'm going to cover a little bit more towards the end here. But truly, what leads to high cholesterol, arteries being clogged, is eating these fake foods, essentially, because they cause us to gain excess body fat due to their high amount of calories, and due to that, we end up seeing weight gain, and we end up seeing a lot of these problems beginning to happen as well. So, like I was saying, there are 3 types of fats. Trans fats are one of them. The second type are saturated fats. So, when we think about saturated fats, they've been demonized by the health and food industry. They've been demonized by saying saturated fats are bad for you. They cause high blood pressure, cholesterol problems, artery clogging problems. And here's the cool thing. If you take a look at the data, when our ancient ancestors, who aren't so ancient, indigenous cultures such as Eskimos, they would live in these communities where they would eat a primarily 80% high fat and high protein diet. When we look at their arteries, when we look at their health conditions, a lot of the problems that we experience here in our society today, they virtually didn't even hear about them or experience them in their society. And it's not because they weren't technologically advanced enough to figure it out. It's because they truly didn't have these problems. In fact, there's an amazing book that helped me get very passionate about health and fitness, it's called Physical and Nutritional Degeneration by Dr. Weston A. Price. And what this doctor did, he was a doctor of dentistry, was he had a son, a 12-year-old son, who unfortunately and tragically died from a dental infection in the mid to early 1920s. And he decided, you know what, with his wife, there's no way that this is just normal and this is acceptable. And he took it upon himself, his wife also, to go out and search out these indigenous cultures who mostly live free from tooth decay, from a lot of these different diseases. And what they discovered from looking at different indigenous tribes, from the Eskimos to indigenous tribes that were untouched by what's called the red man or the white man's food, if you will, they found that these people didn't suffer from dental infections. They died with all of their natural teeth still intact, and they had bounds of energy, amazing health, amazing communities. And so he went and he lived among these people, and long story short, in each and every one of these people, without exception, he found that none of them were vegetarian. And they all ate very much like Native Americans would eat. They would use every part of the animal. They would use every part of the bones of the animal. They ate a very whole food diet, if you will. And so most of their, if not all of their intake of food came from animal protein and animal fats. So the reason I bring up the Eskimos is because they're a little bit of a unique case in that 40 to 60% of their diet came from whale blubber. Whale blubber is the highest source of animal fat. And there are some of the healthiest, strongest, most vital people you'll ever see on the face of the planet. So saturated fats, like you were saying earlier, Oleg, it is about moderation. I'm not saying, wake up tomorrow morning and just, eat a bar of Kerrygold Irish butter. But what I am saying is that you don't have to be afraid of these things. They're going to help you. They're satiating. They're very high in their nutritional value. And they're what we've been eating for tens of thousands of years. They're time-tested in many ways, as opposed to the trans fats that are just, in our recent history of 100 years, that we don't know the long-term ramifications for as of yet. Corn oil, seed oil, sunflower oil, vegetable oil, margarine, all trans fats, all very, very toxic for the human body. What I would recommend using instead, olive oil, butter, ghee, even lard is a phenomenal replacement as well. Avocado oil, coconut oil, can't go wrong with any one of those natural options. Yeah.
Grape seeds.
I think grape seeds okay. Yeah. Grape seeds okay. Sesame oil is okay. I think seed oil is different from grape seed oil. I think those are different. Yeah. So cotton.
Seed is soybean, right?
Yes, we want to avoid the soy. Corn and soy, although like some fermented products like tempeh are okay, tofu to some degree is okay. Soy and corn is some of the very inflammatory. In fact, talk about what causes high cholesterol. Inflammation is a big part of it, right? It is hidden in the label. It's actually very, very mind-opening when you start reading the labels and you start realizing, wow, like maybe there's around 20% of the grocery store that's actually edible and healthy, whereas 80% is not. I like to call them frankenfoods, right? So, Frankenstein foods. You know what's interesting? I recently learned that tuna, there is a cheap alternative that resembles tuna, but that's not actually tuna. That's sometimes in some of these brands. So when you open up your tuna and you slice it open, there should be a little bit of pink on it. And if there's not a little bit of pink on the tuna, then it's very likely that you're not actually eating tuna, but it's a very similar yet cheaper alternative that's actually much more toxic than tuna because of the mercury levels in it as well. So fun fact if you have tuna like I do. And then the last one before we move on to the carbs is the unsaturated fats. So this is what we've been told are the good fats. Olive oil, avocados, nuts, all of these different things. And so the beauty of unsaturated fats is that, as you can see, it decreases LDL, which we've come to have known as a quote-unquote bad cholesterol, right? It decreases LDL. And it also helps with overall stiffness in the cell structurally, helping our cells respond the way they should, form the way they should as well. The main ones I want to talk about are omega-3s and omega-6s, because this is a very relevant and practical example. Especially, we were talking earlier about food quality as well. I love your taking notes, by the way, Sal. We were talking earlier about food quality as well. So we were talking about grass-fed versus factory-raised. We were talking about having essentially grass-fed, factory-raised, wild-caught versus farm-raised. Similarly, when we look at omega-3s, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. We were talking about inflammation earlier. And then omega-6s can be inflammatory when they're taking in the wrong amounts, right? So as you guys can see, when you have a pasture-raised source of eggs or poultry or any other source of meat, look at the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s versus when you have the same exact source, eggs, chicken, beef, you name it. When you have a factory-raised alternative, look at the difference between the omega-3s to the omega-6s. 1 to 4 versus 1 to 16. What does this mean? This means that when you have foods that are factory-raised, farm-raised, that are not wild-caught, pasture-raised, that are not grass-fed, they're much more inflammation-inducing than their pasture-raised, wild-caught, grass-fed counterparts. So you're going to feel much more inflamed and therefore much more prone and susceptible to disease than if you were to have a normal source of protein. Does that make sense? Isn't that crazy? Just changing the carton on your eggs from cage-free to pasture-raised changes how the response is in your body by 4x statistically.
Oh, wait, the eggs, right? So I usually get like brown, non-cage, whatever. So what's the difference between pasteurized and non-cage?
That's a great question. So pasteurized is different from pasture-raised. Pasteurized is, so the way I like to describe it is, let's talk about dairy as an example. There are 3 components to dairy, if you think about it, right? You have your vitamins, minerals, nutrients, of course. Then you have the lactose, which is the sugar, and then you have the fat of the dairy. So because dairy has bacteria in it naturally, think about, the farm back home in Pakistan where like they just drink, right out the cow. So essentially that is dangerous, Natalie, as you're making a facial expression of. So what we do back in, the day, we would boil milk to kill off the bacteria. Now what we do is we pasteurize milk to kill off the bacteria. However, we heat it at such a high temperature that it literally kills a lot of the minerals, the enzymes, the nutrients that make milk such an amazing source of food. So all you're really left with after you pasteurize a food is like fat and sugar. So that's what pasteurization is, right? Pasteurization essentially makes it safe to consume, but the downside is you lose a lot of the minerals and the vitamins with it, right? Pasture raised is where you take a chicken and you put it in a natural environment, outdoors, whereas most chickens are raised in factories, right? So there's like, the main difference is you might have chickens cooped up in a cage on a factory farm being fed grains unnaturally, or you might have a chicken that's maybe a little bit more free to roam, eating a little bit more of its natural feed, if you will. That's the difference between pasture raised and like cage free. And so you can have a brown egg that's cage free. They can even have brown eggs that are like painted brown, but that's not the same as pasture raised.
What's the pasture raised and cage again? Free?
Cage free is like they're not in cages, but they're still.
Out in their element?
So this is market. What's that?
It can still be a factory.
Yes. This is where marketing is so deceiving, and why it's so important to read the labels, right? Because when you see cage-free, you're like, oh, this is great. This is not in a cage, but they're still in a factory. Instead of being in a cage, they're just all clumped up together. If anything, they're worse off because they don't have any room at all anymore. So it's like virtually the same. Yeah.
So you want the package to say
Pasture raised, optimally, or free range.